The first hint of daybreak was a pale, wounded line drawn across the eastern horizon, and Alara was already awake. She had learned long ago that sleep was a luxury the land did not afford. The floorboards of the small cabin were rough and cool beneath her bare feet, a familiar morning greeting. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, her body knowing the geography of the small space in the pre-dawn gloom. First, the fire. She coaxed the embers from the previous night back to life, the small flicker of orange a tiny victory against the vast, indifferent darkness that pressed in from all sides. Her life had become a litany of chores, a relentless cycle of labor that began before the sun and ended long after it had bled out of the western sky. Out in the yard, the wind was already stirring. It was the panhandle's constant companion, a ceaseless whisper that could scour a field of topsoil, drive a man mad with its loneliness, or, on days like this, feel like the sigh of a restless ghost. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wool thin and smelling of wood smoke and sorrow. The chickens clucked expectantly as she scattered their meager ration of corn. Then it was on to the milk cow, Bess, whose warm flank and steady, rhythmic chewing were a small comfort in the silent morning. Her hands, chapped and calloused, worked the cow's teats with an efficiency born of 1,000 such mornings. The thin streams of milk hissing into the metal pail were the sound of survival. After straining the milk, she would begin the real work. The fence along the western pasture needed mending again. The wind and the dust were forever working to undo what she had done, to reclaim the small patch of the world she and Thomas had tried to tame. Every post she braced, every length of wire she stretched taut, was an act of defiance. Thomas had taught her how to do it. "You gotta pull it tight enough to sing. Alara," he would say, his voice a low rumble against the ever-present wind, his hands large and sure over hers. A lazy fence is an invitation to trouble. It had been a year since the trouble had found him, a year since the letter had arrived, carried by a solemn rider who could not meet her eyes. A cattle drive accident, they said, a stampede in a thunderstorm, a quick, violent end to a life that had been all slow strength and quiet conviction. Now, he was everywhere and nowhere. He was in the sturdy walls of the cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. He was in the slight dip in the mattress on the side of the bed where he used to sleep. He was in the way the setting sun caught the rim of the canyon to the south, a sight he had loved. This land was her adversary, a cruel master that had taken her husband and now demanded her very soul as payment to keep it. But it was also her sanctuary, the last place on earth that held the shape of him. To leave would be to lose him all over again, a final, unbearable amputation. And so she stayed, wrestling a living from the scorched earth, her grief a constant, aching presence in the hollow of her chest. The land itself was a testament to hardship. It was a place of brutal simplicity, sky and earth. The sky was a crushing, infinite blue, so vast it could make a person feel like an insignificant speck, an afterthought of creation. The earth was a palette of browns and ochres, cracked and thirsty, broken only by the stubborn green of mesquite and the pale, whispering prairie grass. The sun was a tyrant, beating down without mercy, baking the ground until it was as hard as iron and bleaching the very color from the world. In the summer, heat shimmered off the plains in waves, creating watery mirages that promised relief but delivered only more dust. The wind was the land's voice, and it spoke of loneliness. It carried the scent of distant rain that never fell, the fine grit that worked its way into everything, her food, her clothes, her lungs, and the mournful cry of a lone coyote that echoed her own solitary existence. Her desperation was a quiet, gnawing thing, hidden behind the daily mask of stoic labor. It lived in the pages of the small ledger she kept in a wooden box beneath her bed. The numbers told a starker story than any words could. The column of expenses, for seed, for salt, for flour, for the loan, was long and unforgiving. The column of income, from the few dozen eggs she could sell on her monthly trip to the dusty settlement of Redemption, from the occasional sale of butter, was pitifully short. The final sum at the bottom of the page was always the same. Not enough. The loan was the shadow that hung over it all. A debt held by Silas Croft, a man who owned most of the county and carried himself as if he had a deed to the sky as well. Croft was a cattle baron of the new breed, a man who dealt not just in livestock but in the quiet desperation of smaller landowners. He had lent Thomas the money for a new bull and to dig a deeper well 2 years ago, when hope was still a tangible thing. Now, with Thomas gone, Croft saw not a widow to be helped but an opportunity to be seized. His last visit was burned into her memory. He had ridden up on a massive black gelding that seemed as arrogant as its owner. Croft was a big man, his bulk straining the buttons of his tailored vest, his face weathered not by honest labor but by greed and impatience. He had dismounted and surveyed her small farm with a dismissive gaze, his lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. "It is a hard life for a woman alone, Mrs. Miller," he had said, his voice a low, syrupy drawl that failed to conceal the steel beneath it. He had gestured at her patched barn, her struggling corn patch. "This land requires a man's hand." She had stood her ground on the porch, her hands clenched at her sides. "I am managing—" "Are you?" he'd purred, stepping closer, invading her space. He smelled of sweat, leather, and expensive cigars. "The payment is late again. I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. A shame to see all your husband's hard work go to waste." He had let his eyes drift over her, a slow, appraising look that made her skin crawl. It was not the land he was assessing. She felt like another piece of property he was considering acquiring. The threat was clear. He would take the farm, one way or another. The thought of his thick, possessive hands on the door of the cabin Thomas had built was a violation that filled her with a cold, helpless rage. That afternoon, the world began to change. The wind, for the first time all day, fell silent. The sudden stillness was more unnerving than its constant howl. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down with a humid weight that made it hard to breathe. A strange, unnatural light began to fall over the plains, bathing everything in a sickly, greenish-yellow glow. The chickens in their coop grew quiet, and Bess stood by the fence, her head up, sniffing the air with a low, nervous moo. Ilara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She had seen this sky before. Every plains dweller knew the signs. She scanned the horizon to the southwest, and her blood ran cold. There, beneath a roiling, bruised purple mass of clouds, the sky was beginning to boil. A dark, menacing finger was descending from the heavens, probing the earth. Fear, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. There was no time for thought, only for the desperate, ingrained motions of survival. "Bess!" she shouted, her voice thin against the oppressive silence. She ran to the cow, untied her rope, and slapped her hard on the rump, driving her toward the relative shelter of a shallow ravine 100 yards from the cabin. The cow, sensing the wrongness of the world, bolted. Next, the chickens. She threw open the coop, not bothering to latch it. They would have to take their chances. Her own survival was a matter of seconds. She ran to the cabin, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and shoved a heavy wooden bar across the inside of the door. It was a futile gesture, she knew, but she had to do something. Her real hope lay buried in the earth. The root cellar. Thomas had dug it himself, lining it with thick timbers and fitting it with heavy, angled doors. She sprinted toward it, her eyes fixed on the southwestern sky. The funnel cloud was thicker now, a monstrous, swirling vortex of black that was kicking up a skirt of dust and debris as it chewed its way across the prairie. The air vibrated with a low, distant rumble that was steadily growing louder. It was then, in the terrifying, suspended moments before the storm hit, that she saw it. A lone rider, a dark shape struggling against the horizon. He was pushing his horse hard, trying to outrun the impossible. The wind was hitting him now, a violent, invisible wall. She saw the horse rear up, its scream lost in the rising roar. It twisted in the air, a terrible silhouette of panic, and threw its rider. The man landed hard and did not move. He was just a dark lump on the ground as the first pieces of debris, twigs, leaves, then larger branches, began to whip through the air. For a heartbeat, Alara was frozen. The cellar was 10 feet away. Safety! Her mind screamed at her to get inside, to pull the doors shut and pray. The man was a stranger. Helping him was suicide. But then she saw the image of Thomas, his face earnest and kind. He would not have hesitated. He would have run into the jaws of hell for a stranger. Her fear was overcome by a force even stronger, her own stubborn humanity. With a cry that was torn from her throat by the wind, she ran. The world was a maelstrom of noise and motion. The wind tore at her dress and ripped the pins from her hair, whipping it across her face. Dust and grit stung her eyes, half blinding her. She lowered her head and pushed forward, her legs pumping. Every step an agonizing effort. The roar was deafening now, a physical presence that hammered at her ears. She reached the man and fell to her knees beside him. He was unconscious, a bloody gash on the side of his head where he must have struck a rock. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her hands under his arms and pulled. He barely moved. Panic surged through her. "Get up!" she screamed into the storm. The words useless. She gritted her teeth, tears of effort and terror streaming from her eyes, and dragged him. It was a nightmare of inches. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned. The ground around them was being scourged, the grass flattened as if by a giant, invisible hand. A fence post cartwheeled through the air 20 feet from her head and shattered against the ground. She reached the cellar doors, her body trembling with exhaustion. She somehow found the strength to heave one open, the wind trying to rip it from her grasp. She tumbled inside, pulling the stranger down the few rough steps with her. He landed in a heap at the bottom. She scrambled back up, the roar now an all-consuming, world-ending cataclysm. With the last of her strength, she grabbed the heavy handle of the door and pulled it down. She fumbled for the thick iron hook on the inside and secured it just as the second door slammed shut above her, plunging them into absolute, roaring darkness. The cellar became the center of a universe of chaos. The ground shook violently, as if in the grip of an earthquake. The noise was no longer a sound one heard with the ears. It was a physical blow, a crushing pressure that vibrated through her teeth, her bones, her very soul. It was the sound of 1,000 freight trains, the sound of the world being unmade. Above them, she heard a horrific splintering and screeching of wood and metal, the sound of her cabin, her home, being torn apart. She squeezed her eyes shut and pressed herself into the damp earth of the wall, making herself as small as possible. She could smell the rich, dark soil, the faint scent of rotting potatoes from the last harvest, and the coppery tang of the stranger's blood. His ragged breathing was a faint, fragile sound lost beneath the apocalypse raging just a few feet above their heads. In that black shaking tomb, they were not a man and a woman, not a stranger and a widow. They were two beating hearts, two terrified souls clinging to a sliver of existence in the heart of the maelstrom, bound together by the terrifying, intimate ordeal of survival. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The deafening roar receded, replaced by an eerie, profound silence broken only by the sound of dripping water and her own ragged, sobbing breaths. The silence was almost as frightening as the noise. She lay in the dark for a long time, trembling, waiting. Finally, cautiously, she reached up and unhooked the door. She pushed. It was heavy, blocked by something. She put her shoulder into it and heaved, and it finally scraped open a few feet. Sunlight, blindingly bright, stabbed into the darkness. She crawled out into a world she no longer recognized. Ruin. That was the only word for it. The sky was clear and blue again. a mocking, placid canvas above a scene of utter devastation. Her barn was a pile of splintered lumber. The fences were gone, vanished as if they had never been. The landscape was scarred, gouged, and littered with an impossible collection of debris. Shattered wood, pieces of metal, a child's doll with one eye missing. Its origin a terrifying mystery. Her small cornfield was flattened, scoured down to the bare earth. The cabin was somehow still standing, but it was grievously wounded. The roof on the west side was peeled back like the lid of a can, and the windows were all shattered. A wave of despair so profound it was nauseating washed over her. It was all gone. Everything she had worked for, everything she had bled for, was destroyed in a matter of minutes. The fight was over. The land had finally won. A low groan from the cellar cut through her shock. The stranger? She had almost forgotten him. The duty of care was a powerful anchor in the swirling sea of her grief. She slid back down the steps. He was alive, but his condition was dire. His face was pale beneath a mask of dirt and dried blood, and his breathing was shallow. With tremendous effort, she managed to drag him up the steps and out into the wrecked yard. She got him into the cabin, which was a mess of shattered glass and debris, and onto her bed. Working with a grim, focused calm, she began to tend to his wounds. Her medical knowledge was limited to what a woman on an isolated homestead had to know: how to stitch a cut, set a simple break, and brew teas for a fever. She gently cleaned the gush on his head with whiskey from a bottle she kept for snake bites. The cut was deep, right to the bone. His left arm was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle below the elbow. She found 2 sturdy pieces of a broken floorboard and tore strips from a clean sheet to make a splint, setting the bone as best she could. As she worked, a fever began to take hold of him. His skin grew hot and dry to the touch, and he began to mutter. His words fragmented and nonsensical, dredged up from some deep, tormented place. He tossed his head back and forth on the pillow, his eyes squeezed shut in some internal agony. "Sarah," he murmured, the name a raw, broken plea. "The fire, so much smoke." His body tensed, his good hand clenching into a fist. "Could not get to her. My fault." The words were a ghostly whisper, but they landed on Alara's heart with the weight of stones. He was lost in a nightmare of his own, a hell of fire and failure. She placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, her touch gentle, in his unconsciousness, in his helpless vulnerability. She saw past the blood and the dirt. She saw not a stranger she had rescued from a storm, but a fellow traveler in the desolate landscape of grief. His soul, like hers, was marked by a profound and terrible loss, and in that quiet, ruined cabin, surrounded by the wreckage of her life, she felt the first, faint stirring of a connection, a kinship with the broken man who had been delivered to her door by the cruelest of winds. The fever broke on the 3rd day. Alara was wringing out a cloth in a basin of cool well water when she heard a low groan from the bed that was different from the delirious muttering of the past 2 nights. She turned to see the stranger's eyes were open, not wide and wild with fever, but narrowed and focused, tracking her movements with a weary intelligence. The deep, haunted sadness she had glimpsed in his unconscious state was now settled in them like silt at the bottom of a river. "Easy now," she said softly, her voice feeling loud in the quiet cabin. "You took a bad fall. You have been out for a while." She approached the bed slowly, holding the damp cloth. He did not flinch, but his body was tense, a coiled spring of watchfulness. She gently dabbed his forehead, wiping away the sheen of sweat. His eyes never left her face. "Where?" His voice was a dry, cracking rasp. "My homestead," she answered. "The tornado threw you from your horse." He absorbed this information without expression, his gaze sweeping over the patched roof and the boarded-up window frame. He saw the ruin and understood. He tried to push himself up, then winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth as the pain from his broken arm and battered body made itself known. "Do not try to move," she advised, placing a gentle but firm hand on his good shoulder. "You need to rest. You lost a lot of blood." He settled back against the pillows, his jaw tight. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the damaged roof. "Thank you," he finally said, the words costing him an effort. Anyone would have done the same. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Most would have bolted for their own cellar. "What should I call you?" she asked, her tone practical. He hesitated for a moment, as if the question were complicated. "Jack," he said at last. "Just Jack." He offered no more. No family name, no destination, no reason for riding into the teeth of a storm. And Alara, who understood the comfort of a locked past, did not ask. The days that followed fell into a quiet, spare rhythm. Jack's recovery was slow, marked by long periods of sleep and a deep, brooding silence when he was awake. Alara moved about her chores with a new, quiet purpose. She would bring him broth, then later, plates of stew and cornbread. They ate their meals in a silence that was not awkward, but thick with unspoken things. It was the silence of two people who had stood together in the roaring dark and survived. A powerful current of understanding flowed between them, a language without words. She understood the grief in his eyes because she saw it in her own reflection in the window pane each morning. He seemed to understand the weary set of her shoulders, the way she pushed on long after exhaustion had set in. He would watch her for hours from the bed, his gaze following her as she swept the floor, kneaded dough, or mended a tear in her dress with small, precise stitches. It was not a prying look, but a steady, contemplative one. He watched the way her hands, though rough and calloused, moved with a determined grace. He saw the strength in the line of her back as she hauled buckets of water from the well. His expression was a mixture of profound gratitude and something deeper, an emerging wonder, as if he were seeing a kind of resilience he had long forgotten existed in the world. For Alara, his quiet presence was a strange comfort. The crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death began to feel less. The cabin no longer felt so empty. It now held two solitudes, which, side by side, seemed less lonely than one. On the fifth day, the sound of an approaching horse sent a familiar spike of anxiety through Alara's chest. She stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw the imposing figure of Silas Croft astride his black gelding. He reined in, his eyes sweeping over the devastation with a cold, proprietary air. The tornado had been a gift to him, another tool to pry her from this land. "Mrs. Miller," he began, swinging his bulk from the saddle. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that was entirely false. His voice was a thick, syrupy drawl. "I heard the storm hit you hard. A terrible tragedy, simply terrible." "We are managing Mr. Croft," Alara said, her voice stiff. She did not invite him closer. He ignored her tone, stepping onto the porch as if he owned it. He was close enough now that she could smell the cigar smoke clinging to his coat. "Managing?" He gestured with his hat toward the wrecked barn. "It takes more than a woman's touch to raise a barn. My dear, this land is unforgiving. It requires a firm hand." His eyes roamed over her, and she felt the familiar, crawling sensation of being appraised like livestock. "Perhaps it is time to accept a practical solution. My offer to take this land off your hands still stands. It would be a mercy, truly, save you from a great deal of hardship." The word hardship was a veiled threat, a reminder of the debt that hung over her head like a guillotine. "The farm is not for sale," she said, her chin high. Croft's thin smile tightened. "Stubbornness is an admirable quality, but it does not pay the bills. The note is past due. I have been patient, considering your circumstances." His gaze drifted past her, through the open cabin door, and settled on the figure lying in the bed inside. His eyes narrowed. Well, what have we here?" He pushed past her into the cabin, his presence filling the small space. sucking the air out of it. He stood over the bed, looking down at Jack with open contempt. Jack, though pale and weak, met his gaze with a look as hard and unyielding as granite. "It seems your circumstances have changed," Croft sneered, a leering insinuation in his tone. He turned back to Alara. "I did not realize you had taken in a stray. I hope for your sake he is worth the trouble." The insult hung in the air, crude and possessive. Alara's face burned with humiliation and rage. "He was injured in the storm," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It was a matter of Christian charity." Charity. Croft repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept. "Charity is a luxury for those who can afford it. Mrs. Miller, you are not among them." He placed his hat back on his head, a gesture of finality. "I will be back in 1 month. With the sheriff, I expect my money, or I will have my land." He turned and strode out of the cabin without a backward glance, leaving a trail of menace in his wake. Alara stood trembling, her fists clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. The fragile peace of the last few days had been shattered. When she finally turned, her eyes met Jack's. The deep sadness in his expression was gone. In its place was a cold, chilling fury. It was a look of such absolute, contained rage that it startled her. He had said nothing, done nothing. But in that moment, she saw a different man. Not just a victim of a storm, but someone who understood predators like Silas Croft on a fundamental level. He said nothing, but a silent promise passed between them. He had seen the jackal at her door, and his protective instinct, long dormant and buried under his own grief, had been ignited. As the days turned into a week, then 2, Jack's strength slowly returned. The gash on his head began to heal, and the fever was a distant memory. The bone in his arm was knitting, but it remained in a sling, a constant source of frustration for him. He was not a man built for idleness. The sight of Alara working from dawn until dusk, her face etched with worry and fatigue, clearly grated on him. One morning, as she was wrestling with a heavy timber to patch a hole in the barn wall, he appeared beside her. "I can help," he said. It was not a question. "You are still healing," she protested. "You need to rest." "I have done enough resting." His jaw was set. "Show me what to do." And so they began to work. It was awkward at first. He had to learn how to be useful with only one good arm. But he was resourceful and determined. He could brace a board with his shoulder while she hammered. He could use his good hand to twist wire for the fences, his teeth holding the other end. He learned to split kindling by holding the log steady with his boot and swinging the axe with a short, controlled chop. They fell into a comfortable, efficient rhythm, a silent team united against the ruin surrounding them. They worked side by side, from the first cool light of dawn until the last amber rays of sunset faded from the sky. The shared labor became a new kind of language between them, more intimate than any conversation, a bond forged in the sweat and strain of rebuilding. Simple moments became charged with an unspoken emotion. Her hand would brush his as she passed him a hammer, and a current, warm and startling, would pass between them. He would hold a post steady for her, his eyes on her face, watching the concentration in her brow, the stray strands of sun-bleached hair that escaped her bun and danced in the constant breeze. One afternoon, they were on the low roof of the barn, patching the hole the storm had torn. He was holding the new planks in place while she nailed them down. Her hammer slipped, striking her thumb with a glancing blow. She cried out, a sharp hiss of pain, and dropped the hammer. It clattered down the roof and fell to the ground below. "Let me see," he said, his voice quiet with concern. She held out her hand, her thumb already swelling and turning a dark purple. He took her hand in his. His grip was surprisingly gentle, his calloused fingers a stark contrast to the care in his touch. He examined the injury, his brow furrowed. He was so close she could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair and the fine lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his hand, the solid, comforting weight of it. The wind picked up, whipping her hair across her face, and he reached up with his good hand to gently tuck a strand behind her ear. The gesture was so simple, so natural, that it stole the breath from her lungs. Their eyes met and held for a long, suspended moment. The world seemed to shrink to the space of that rooftop, to the space between their two faces. The loneliness that had defined both their lives, that had been a constant, aching void, began to recede, filled by the warmth of this shared closeness. He finally released her hand, the spell broken. But something had shifted between them, an invisible wall crumbling to dust. That night, the air was still and cool. A near full moon bathed the scarred landscape in a soft, silvery light, making the devastation seem almost beautiful, peaceful. They had finished a late supper, the silence in the cabin now a comfortable, shared space. Alara was mending a tear in Jack's shirt, the only one he had, while he sat by the hearth, staring into the low flames. The weight of the day's labor had settled into her bones, a good, honest ache. For the first time since Thomas's death, a fragile tendril of hope had begun to unfurl in her heart. They were rebuilding, together. The sound that woke her was a choked, desperate cry. She sat bolt upright in her bed, her heart pounding. It came again, from the small cot on the other side of the room where Jack slept. It was a sound of pure agony. She threw back the thin blanket and rushed to his side. In the pale moonlight filtering through the window, she could see him thrashing, caught in the grips of a violent nightmare. His good arm flailed, his body was rigid, and his face was a mask of torment. "No, Sarah!" he cried out, his voice thick with sleep and terror. "The door, it is jammed! I cannot— the smoke—" He began to cough, a dry, racking sound that seemed to shake his entire body. "My fault! All my fault!" He was living it again, the horror that had put the permanent sadness in his eyes. He was in the fire from his fever dreams. Alara's heart broke for him. She knew this kind of grief, the kind that gives no quarter, even in sleep. He thrashed again, his arm striking the wall beside the cot with a dull thud. "Jack," she said softly, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Jack, wake up," he gasped, his eyes flying open. They were wide with terror and confusion, seeing not the quiet cabin but the flames of his memory. He recoiled from her touch, scrambling to sit up, his breathing coming in ragged, panicked gulps. He was drenched in a cold sweat, his body trembling. Alara did not ask what he had seen. She did not press him for details or offer empty words of comfort. She understood that some wounds were too deep for words. Instead, she sat on the edge of the cot, her presence a quiet, steady anchor in his stormy sea of panic. She reached out and took his good hand. It was clammy and trembling, but he did not pull away. She held it firmly in both of hers, grounding him in the here and now, in the moonlight of the ruined cabin, in safety. He did not explain the dream. He did not have to. His raw, terrible vulnerability was laid bare in the moonlit room. He allowed her to see the shattered man behind the quiet, stoic facade, the man haunted by ghosts of fire and failure, and she, in her quiet, unwavering way, accepted it all without judgment. She simply sat with him in the darkness, holding his hand, sharing the weight of his unspeakable pain. The minutes stretched into an hour, and his trembling slowly subsided. His breathing evened out. He never spoke a word, but when he finally looked at her, his eyes were clear, and they held a look of such profound, heartbreaking gratitude that it made her own heart ache in response. In that shared, silent moment of utter desolation, their connection was solidified, forged not in the rebuilding of a farm, but in the quiet acceptance of their broken pieces. The fragile piece they had built together, plank by plank and wire by wire, lasted less than a fortnight. It was shattered not by wind or weather, but by the plodding, Official sound of 2 horses arriving in the yard. Alara's heart seized. It was Sheriff Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of weary apology. And with him, one of his deputies. The sheriff held a folded piece of paper in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. Jack, who had been sanding a new door for the cabin, stopped his work. He stood silently by the porch, his good arm resting on a post, his eyes narrowed and watchful. He was nearly healed now, the sling discarded for a week, his movements still careful but regaining their natural strength. "Alara," the sheriff said, avoiding her eyes and looking somewhere over her shoulder at the distant mesas. "I am sorry to be the one to bring this." He held out the paper. Her hand trembled as she took it. It was thick and formal, covered in dense, blocky print and sealed at the bottom with a smear of red wax. A foreclosure notice. The words swam before her eyes, a jumble of legal terms she barely understood. But the numbers were brutally clear. Silas Croft was claiming an exorbitant sum, a figure inflated with fraudulent interest rates and punitive fees that made it impossibly, laughably out of reach. It was more than the farm would be worth in 100 years. The final line was a death sentence, 30 days to pay, or vacate the property. "This cannot be right," she whispered, the paper shaking. "The amount, it is wrong." "Croft has the loan papers, all signed and legal," Sheriff Miller mumbled, finally meeting her gaze. His own was filled with a mixture of pity and helplessness. "My hands are tied. He is a powerful man. Alara, you know that." She did know. She saw that power in the way the sheriff's shoulders were slumped, in the way his deputy kept his eyes fixed on his saddle horn. Croft's influence was a poison that had seeped into the very soul of the county, turning good men into cowards and the law into a weapon for the wealthy. The news traveled on the wind, as news always did in the sparse, lonely landscape of the Panhandle. Her monthly trip to the settlement of Redemption for supplies became an exercise in humiliation, where before she had received nods of quiet respect for her resilience. She now faced a wall of silence. Martha, the storekeeper's wife, who used to trade recipes with her, suddenly became intensely busy counting cans on a shelf when Alara entered. Men who had known Thomas since he was a boy now found the dust at their feet fascinating. They were not cruel people, but they were fearful. Siding with Alara meant crossing Silas Croft, and no one was willing to risk that. She was an outcast, a woman marked for failure, and her struggle was a contagion they were afraid to catch. The hope that had begun to bloom in her chest withered and died, turning to a cold, hard knot of despair in her stomach. The work on the farm, which had felt so purposeful when she and Jack worked together, now seemed futile, like building a sandcastle against a rising tide. One evening, sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun set in a blaze of defiant color, the last of her strength crumbled. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep. They were not loud, dramatic sobs, but the silent, racking tears of a soul that had fought for too long and had nothing left. She had failed. She had failed to save the farm. She had failed to protect the one tangible piece of Thomas she had left. Jack came out of the cabin and sat on the step beside her. He did not speak, did not touch her. He simply sat there, his presence a solid, unwavering thing in her world of ruin. After a long time, her tears subsided, leaving her hollowed out and exhausted. "He has won," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "I tried so hard. I wanted to keep this place for Thomas, to prove I could, but I cannot. I have failed him." "You have not failed anyone," Jack said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You have fought harder than anyone I have ever known." He held out his hand. "Let me see the notice again." She retrieved it from the cabin and gave it to him. He smoothed the paper out on his knee, and in the fading light, he read it. His quiet, reserved demeanor fell away, replaced by an intense, focused concentration that surprised her. His eyes, which so often held a distant sadness, were now sharp and analytical. scanning the document with a frightening intelligence. A long silence passed. The muscles in his jaw worked, and a cold, dangerous light sparked in his eyes. "This is not a legal document," he said at last, his voice flat and hard. "This is a piece of toilet paper written by a thief." Ilara stared at him. "What do you mean?" He tapped a line on the paper with his finger. "This interest rate. It is predatory, illegal in any sane jurisdiction. This late fee clause, it is fraudulent. And this here, the property description is deliberately vague. He is trying to lay claim to your water rights, which are deeded separately. This entire document is a sham, designed to intimidate someone who does not know the law." She was stunned into silence. The quiet, broken man she had nursed back to health was dissecting the complex legal document with the precision of a Philadelphia lawyer. He spoke with an authority and a certainty that she had never heard from him before. "But the sheriff," she began. "The sheriff is either a fool or on Croft's payroll." "Probably both," Jack said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "He is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the land registry." His eyes met hers, and for the first time in weeks, she saw not pity, but a fierce, resolute conviction. "We ride to Blackstone at dawn. We go to the county seat, and we pull the original deed and the loan agreement from the records office. We are going to expose this for the fraud it is." A fragile, tentative glimmer of hope sparked to life in the barren wasteland of her heart. It was a foolish hope, she thought, to place her faith in a man she knew nothing about, a man named only Jack. But the absolute certainty in his voice was a lifeline, and she was drowning. "Blackstone," she said. "That is a 2-day ride." "Then we had best get some sleep," he said, standing up. "We have a long journey ahead of us." They left before the sun, with 2 horses packed with what little they had: a bedroll, a canteen of water, a sack of dried beef and hardtack, the panhandle unfurled before them, a vast and unforgiving canvas. The land was starkly beautiful, a place of sweeping vistas, towering rock formations that looked like ancient, forgotten castles, and a sky so wide it felt like the lid of the world. But it was also dangerous. Rattlesnakes sunned themselves on warm rocks, and the sun beat down with a relentless intensity. They rode for hours in a comfortable silence, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves the only sound besides the ever-present wind. The journey was a crucible, forcing them into a new kind of intimacy. They relied on each other for everything. He showed her how to find the clearest path through a rocky arroyo. She pointed out a hidden spring she knew of, a patch of impossible green in the middle of the parched landscape. When a sudden violent thunderstorm rolled in during the afternoon, he guided them to the shelter of a shallow cave, where they waited out the deluge, their shoulders nearly touching in the cramped space. The air was electric, charged with the storm outside and a different, more personal storm building between them. That evening, they made camp by a small, gurgling creek, the only source of running water for miles. The cottonwood trees that lined its banks whispered in the breeze, their leaves rustling like secrets. After a simple meal, they sat by the small campfire, watching the flames dance and spit. Above them, the sky was a blanket of black velvet, punctured by a million brilliant, glittering stars. The silence of the wilderness was profound, a deep and resonant quiet that seemed to draw the truth out of a person. "I have not seen stars like this in a very long time," Jack said quietly, his gaze fixed on the heavens. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to her, his face serious in the flickering firelight. "Ilara, I have not been entirely honest with you." Her heart gave a small, nervous flutter. "Not with my words," he continued, "but with my silence. You have shown me a kindness I had forgotten existed in this world. When you found me, I was lost. I had been riding for weeks, going nowhere, running from a life I could no longer bear. For years, I have been living in a darkness of my own making. Meeting you, seeing your strength, your goodness, It has been the first light I have felt in a very long time." His voice was thick with an emotion she could not name. It was more than gratitude. It was a raw, painful honesty. Tears pricked at her own eyes. His words touched the core of her own loneliness, the deep, aching void that Thomas's death had left behind. "You have helped me too, Jack," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "After Thomas died, this land, it was so quiet, so empty. I thought I would never feel anything but alone again. But since you have been here, it has been less quiet. I have been less alone." The air between them crackled, the unspoken feelings that had been building for weeks, in the quiet meals, in the shared labor, in the fleeting touches and held gazes, were finally rising to the surface, undeniable and powerful. He leaned toward her, his eyes searching her face in the firelight, asking a question for which there were no words. She gave him his answer by leaning in to meet him. The kiss was everything that had been left unsaid. It was gentle at first, hesitant, a question and an answer all at once. Then it deepened, becoming a desperate, hungry thing. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of mutual healing, of a fierce and fragile hope. It was the touch of a man who had been starved of light and a woman who had been starved of comfort. In that moment, under the vast, indifferent gaze of the stars, they were not a widow and a stranger, but two broken souls finding a moment of perfect, breathtaking wholeness in each other's arms. It was a promise of a future that seemed, in the face of all the obstacles before them, almost impossible. They arrived in Blackstone the next afternoon. It was a world away from the dusty, wind-swept settlement of Redemption. Blackstone was the county seat, a proper town with a wide, bustling main street, 2-story brick buildings, a hotel with a real balcony, and the imposing stone edifice of the county courthouse. The air was filled with the sounds of commerce, the ringing of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of freight wagons, the murmur of conversations from the saloons. Alara felt small and out of place in her worn farm dress, the dust of the trail clinging to her. Jack seemed to transform as they rode down the main street. The quiet, reserved man she knew was gone. He sat taller in his saddle, his gaze sweeping over the town with a look of familiarity and assessment. There was a confidence in him, an air of purpose that she had only glimpsed when he had analyzed the foreclosure notice. They dismounted in front of the Blackstone County Land Registry office, a sturdy brick building with tall, arched windows. "Wait for me here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He handed her the reins to his horse and strode toward the entrance of the building with a long, confident stride that was utterly alien to her. He did not look like a man going to challenge a claim. He looked like a man going to inspect his property. Alara waited. An hour passed, then another. She watched the people of Blackstone go about their business, men in fine suits and bowler hats, women with fashionable dresses and parasols. She felt a profound sense of unease, a feeling that she had crossed a threshold into a world where she did not belong. Jack was a part of this world. She realized with a sudden, chilling certainty. He fit here in a way he never had at her small, struggling farm. Finally, after nearly 3 hours had passed, he emerged from the building. The transformation was complete. The humble, quiet Jack was gone entirely, replaced by a man of immense, palpable authority. His posture was commanding. His face was set in a hard, unreadable expression, and he held a thick stack of papers in his hand. He radiated a power that was so intense it was almost a physical force. People on the street, who had paid him no mind when he arrived, now seemed to notice him, their gazes sliding away with a mixture of curiosity and deference. He walked directly to her, his eyes holding an emotion she could not decipher. It was not the warmth of the man who had kissed her by the creek. It was something heavier, more complicated. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice small. "Did they listen?" "They listened," he said, his voice a low, flat tone she did not recognize. He looked at her, and she saw a deep regret in his eyes. "Ilara, there is something you need to know. My name is not Jack." She stared at him, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum of dread against her ribs. "My full name," he said, the words falling like stones into the space between them, "is Jackson Thorne." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, the weight it carried, told her it should. He saw the confusion on her face and continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "Silas Croft took out his loan from the Blackstone Cattlemen's Bank. I own that bank. He filed his fraudulent claim in that records office. I own this building, and the land it sits on. In fact, I own nearly every major enterprise and parcel of land in this county, from here to the Red River. Your small farm, Ilara, is a tiny island in the vast ocean of my holdings." He paused, letting the impossible weight of his words sink in. "I was not running from my life. I was running from my name. It is a self-imposed exile from a life and a fortune that have brought me nothing but pain." Ilara stood stunned into absolute silence, the horse's reins limp in her hand. The world around her seemed to recede, the sounds of the street fading to a dull roar in her ears. Jackson Thorne, the man she had pulled from the mud, the broken soul she had nursed back to health, the partner who had worked beside her, the man who had kissed her with such desperate tenderness. He was a lie, a fiction. She felt a profound, sickening wave of betrayal wash over her, followed by a hot flush of foolishness. She had opened her home and her heart to him, believing they were equals in their brokenness. Two small souls against a harsh world, but they were not equals. He was a king, and she was a peasant he had stumbled upon. Their simple, powerful connection was now overshadowed by an immense, insurmountable wall of wealth and power. In that moment, standing before the richest and most powerful man she had ever met, Ilara felt smaller, more vulnerable, and more utterly alone than she ever had in her life. The 2-day ride back to the farm was a journey through a landscape of heavy, painful silence. The vast, beautiful territory they had crossed on the way to Blackstone now seemed alien and mocking, its wide-open spaces a reflection of the immense, unbridgeable chasm that had opened between them. Ilara rode with a rigid straightness in her back, her eyes fixed on the horizon, seeing nothing. The memory of the kiss by the creek was a hot coal of shame in her mind. It had felt so real, so honest. Now it felt like a transaction she had not understood, a moment of fleeting amusement for a man who owned the world, a dalliance with a simple farm woman. Jackson, she could not bring herself to think of him as Jack anymore, rode a few paces behind her, the silence from her a physical blow. He made several attempts to break it, his voice rough and uncertain. "Ilara, please, let me explain." She gave no response, her profile as unforgiving as the stone mesas in the distance. "Nothing has changed," he tried again, his desperation making his voice raw. "I am the same man who worked beside you, the man you pulled from the storm." That finally broke her silence. She reined in her horse so sharply it tossed its head in protest. She turned in her saddle to face him, her eyes blazing with a hurt so profound it looked like fury. "The same man? The man I knew was a wanderer with nothing to his name but the shirt on his back and the sorrow in his eyes. He was my equal. Who are you? You are a lie, a rich man's game." "It was not a game," he insisted, moving his horse closer. "Jack is who I am. Jackson Thorne is a role I was born into, a curse I have tried my entire life to escape." "A curse?" She let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "You call owning half the county a curse? Try seeing your home and your husband's memory about to be stolen by a vulture, with nothing but your own 2 hands to fight him. That is a curse. Mr. Thorne, what you have is power." She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "You let me struggle. You watched me grieve and worry myself sick over a debt you could have paid with the dust on your boots. Was it pity? Did you pity the poor widow, playing along with her little drama?" "No, never!" he said, his face stricken. But he had no answer. What could he say? He had wanted her to know him, the man, not the name, but in hiding the name, he had made the man a falsehood. Defeated. He fell silent. The rest of the journey was made in that same suffocating quiet, the unspoken accusations and regrets hanging thicker than dust in the air between them. News, like wildfire on a dry prairie, travels faster than a horse. The source was likely a telegraph wire humming its way out of Blackstone, carrying the astonishing information that the reclusive Jackson Thorne had reappeared. By the time they were a few miles from her homestead, the world had already changed. They encountered Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper from Redemption, driving his wagon in the opposite direction. Just weeks ago, he had found the far wall of his store intensely interesting when she had come in for flour. Now, he pulled his wagon to a complete halt, yanking on the reins so hard his mules grunted in protest. He leaped to the ground and swept off his hat with a flourish. His face split in a wide, obsequious grin. Mrs. Miller, a good day to you, he boomed, his eyes flicking nervously toward Jackson. And Mr. Thorne, sir, a true honor. A true honor to have you in our humble part of the world. Elara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She was no longer just Elara. She was an addendum to the man beside her. Henderson's wife, Martha, peered out from the wagon seat, her face a mixture of awe and frantic curiosity. Elara, dear, she called, her voice several notes higher than usual. I baked an extra apple pie this morning. Please, you must take it. For all your trouble. It was not an act of neighborly kindness. It was an offering, a tribute. Elara looked at the pie as if it were a coiled snake. Thank you, Martha, but that is not necessary, she said, her voice cool. The Hendersons' fawning respect was a mirror held up to her new reality. She was no longer an independent woman, a widow defined by her own grit and labor. In the eyes of the world, she was now an object of intense speculation, a curiosity attached to a great man. She was Thorne's woman. The title felt like a brand, erasing everything she was and had fought to be. When they arrived back at the farm, a sleek, black carriage and 2 fine saddle horses were already there, attended by a man in a driver's uniform who bowed his head as they approached. Jackson had summoned his resources. The quiet homestead was no longer her sanctuary. It had become the headquarters for a king reclaiming his throne. Jackson, now fully resuming the identity he claimed to despise, acted with a swift and brutal efficiency that was breathtaking to behold. He sent the driver with a sealed note to Silas Croft's ranch. The message was not an invitation. It was a summons. Croft arrived less than 2 hours later, riding hard, his face flushed with irritation and arrogance. He clearly expected to find Elara alone, to intimidate and bully her further. He stormed onto the porch, his spurs clinking, a sneer already forming on his lips. I received your message, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. If you think... He stopped dead. Jackson Thorne stepped out of the shadows of the cabin, moving with a fluid grace that held a predator's promise of violence. He was not the worn-down wanderer Croft had dismissed as a stray. He was tall, powerful, and radiating an aura of absolute command. Croft's face went white. The color drained from his ruddy cheeks, and his jaw went slack. He recognized the man before him, not from a chance encounter in a cabin, but from reputation, from the whispers that followed the name Thorne like a cold wind. Thorne, Croft breathed, his arrogance vanishing like a puff of smoke. Croft, Jackson said, his voice quiet, almost conversational but laced with a chilling coldness. He held up the foreclosure notice. This is an interesting piece of fiction you have created. It is a legal matter of a loan, Croft stammered, trying to regain his footing. A simple business transaction. There is nothing simple about fraud, Jackson said. He took a step forward, and Croft instinctively took a step back. My agents in Blackstone have been very busy this morning. They pulled every land deal you have made in the last 5 years. A fascinating pattern of predatory loans to struggling families. A curious number of cattle brands being altered on the open range. The Andersons, the Garcias, the Petersons, all pushed off their land with documents just as creative as this one. Jackson let the notice fall from his fingers. It fluttered to the porch like a dead leaf. You are not a businessman. Croft, you are a parasite who has gotten fat preying on the weak. The sheriff and his deputy arrived then, clearly summoned by the same invisible network of power that had brought the carriage. Sheriff Miller's face was pale. He was no longer a man serving Croft. He was a man terrified of Thorne. "Sheriff," Jackson said, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "I believe you will find Mr. Croft has engaged in numerous counts of fraud, extortion, and cattle rustling. I have taken the liberty of compiling the evidence for you." He gestured to a thick portfolio of papers on the porch railing, delivered by one of his men. "I expect you to do your duty, and I expect to hear that he has lost everything he stole. His ranch, his cattle, his freedom, everything." Croft sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "You cannot." "I can," Jackson interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "I already have. Get him off this land." Justice was served. The vulture was caged. Elara watched as the sheriff, now a model of efficiency, put Silas Croft in irons and led him away. A broken, defeated man. But she felt no triumph. She felt nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. The monumental struggle that had defined her existence, the fight for her home and her husband's legacy, had been resolved in less than an hour by a display of power she could barely comprehend. Jackson had not helped her win her fight. He had simply erased it, and her, from the equation. She felt like a child whose squabble had been ended by an omnipotent father. Her own strength, her own sleepless nights and back-breaking days had been rendered utterly insignificant. She was a damsel in distress, a footnote in a story about a powerful man. The distance she felt from him grew into a frozen tundra. He saw the pain and unhappiness in her eyes and, misunderstanding its source, sought to bridge the gap. He dismissed the fine carriage and the liveried man. A trunk of expensive, tailored clothes that had arrived from Blackstone was sent back, unopened. He put his old, worn work shirt back on, the one she had mended, and picked up a hammer, attempting to resume his life as Jack. But the illusion was irrevocably broken. The easy rhythm they had found in their shared labor was gone. Now his movements seemed clumsy, his efforts hollow. It was no longer a partnership. It was a performance. Jackson Thorne, the man who owned the county, was playing at being a simple laborer, and the act was an insult to the genuine hardship she had known. Then the gifts began to arrive. A massive, prize-winning Hereford bull was delivered to her pasture, a creature worth more than her entire farm. 2 ranch hands appeared one morning and, following Thorne's orders, began rebuilding her barn with new, milled lumber from a town 50 miles away. A delivery wagon brought a bolt of deep blue silk from a dressmaker in Blackstone, a fabric so fine it felt like water running through her fingers. He brought them to her as offerings, as tokens of his affection. But she saw them only as charity, as transactions. He was the benefactor. She was the recipient. He was the lord of the manor, and she was his ward. Each gift was another brick in the wall being built between them, a wall made of his wealth and her pride. She quietly refused them all. The bull was sent back. The ranch hands were politely told their services were not needed. The bolt of silk remained on the table, untouched. The simmering tension finally exploded one evening, a week after Croft had been taken away. Jackson came into the cabin after a frustrating, performative day of mending a fence she could have fixed in half the time. He saw the untouched silk on the table, and the frustration and pain in him finally broke its leash. "Why will you not let me help you?" he demanded, his voice tight with anguish. Why do you push away everything I try to do, everything I try to give you?" "Give me!" she cried, whirling to face him, the tears she had been holding back for days finally spilling over, hot and angry. "You are not giving. You are buying. You think you can fix everything with your money, that you can pave over the past with gold and bulls and fine fabrics. You cannot buy my affection. Jackson, you cannot erase what you did." "What I did? I saved your farm." "No!" she sobbed, the word torn from the very root of her soul. "You took my fight. I did not need a savior. I needed a partner. I fell in love with a man who was my equal, a man who was as broken and lonely as I was. I loved his quiet strength, the sadness in his eyes. I loved Jack. I do not even know this man who stands before me, this stranger who waves his hand and makes the world bend to his will. I do not want a powerful benefactor. I wanted the man who held my hand in the dark." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face a mask of pain and desperation. In his frustration, the truth of his own prison was finally wrenched from him. "You think this power is a gift?" he asked, his voice cracking. "It is a curse. It is a poison that taints everything it touches." He ran a hand through his hair, his carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. "My fortune. It is tainted by the tragedy that took my family. I was away on business, making more money I did not need, when a man I had ruined in a deal set fire to my home. My wife, Sarah, my little girl, they died because I was not there. This money, this power, could not save them. It is worthless." He looked at her, his eyes raw with a grief so profound it was terrifying to witness. "You are the first person in years who looked at me and did not see the name, the fortune. You saw a man, just a man, and I was so desperate to keep that. I lied to you." His voice dropped to a shattered whisper. "My deepest fear is that this wealth is all I am, that it destroys everything pure it touches, that no one is capable of loving me for myself. And now I have used it to destroy the one pure thing I have found." The raw, honest confession hung in the air between them, a testament to their shared tragedy. They were both shattered, standing on opposite sides of a divide that had been built by his lies and fortified by his power. The chasm seemed impossible to cross, the silence filled only with the sound of their two broken hearts. The days that followed their argument were heavy with a silence that was worse than any storm. The cabin, once a shared space of healing and quiet understanding, became a battlefield of unspoken resentments and deep, aching sorrow. They moved around each other like ghosts, the air thick with the words that had been said and the chasm they had created. Alara worked with a grim, relentless determination, her movements sharp and brittle. Jackson watched her, a hollowed-out look in his eyes, the immense power he wielded in the outside world utterly useless within the four walls of this small wooden home. His fortune could buy anything except a way back to the man he had been in her eyes. He reached his breaking point on a morning so clear and bright it felt like a personal insult. He was watching her split firewood, the axe rising and falling with a fierce, punishing rhythm. He saw not just a woman doing a chore, but a soul fortifying her walls against him, one log at a time. He realized then, with a clarity that was as painful as a knife twisting in his gut, that he could not build a future on a foundation of ghosts. His past was not a memory. It was a poison, and it was contaminating the one good, pure thing he had found in his desolate life. He could not ask her to live with his demons until he had the courage to face them himself. He waited until she was done, her face flushed with effort, her breathing heavy. He approached her slowly, stripped of all his authority, all his power. He was just a man, his heart in his hands. "Alara," he began, his voice rough. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but there is a place I have to go, a place I have not seen since before. I cannot go alone." She looked at him, her expression guarded, weary. "And what does this have to do with me?" "Everything," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It is the place where my old life ended, my ranch, where the fire was. The words hung in the air, heavy and dark. I have to go back. I have to stand there and see it, or I will never be free of it. You are the only person who has ever seen the man behind the name, the only person who knows Jack. He is the one who is too afraid to go, and he needs your strength, not as a lover. He stumbled over the word, the memory of their kiss a fresh wound. But as the only person on earth who I believe is strong enough to stand in the ashes with me. His vulnerability was absolute. He was not Jackson Thorne, the man who owned the county, asking for an escort. He was Jack, the broken man she had pulled from the mud, begging for help. She saw in his eyes the same terror she had seen on the night of his nightmare. Her own hurt was still a raw, aching thing, but she recognized this journey for what it was, the only possible path forward for him, and therefore, the only fragile hope for any future they might have together. After a long, searching moment, she gave a single, slow nod. I will go with you. The journey was long and somber, taking them north into a different country. They left the familiar plains of the Panhandle behind, traveling into a region of rolling hills dotted with ancient, gnarled oak trees. It was a land that felt older, sadder. The silence between them was different now. It was not the angry, brittle silence of the cabin, but a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind that precedes a final reckoning. On the second day, as they rode through a valley shadowed by tall, stony cliffs, Jackson finally began to speak. He did not look at her, but kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, as if the story could only be told to the empty landscape. Her name was Sarah, he began, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. She loved this country. She said the hills had a gentler soul than the flatlands. We met in St. Louis. I was there on business. She was unlike anyone I had ever known. She did not care about the Thorne name, or the money. She laughed at my seriousness. She saw the man I wanted to be. He spoke of their life together, painting a picture of a world so far removed from Alara's that it seemed like a fairy tale. He described a grand ranch house with windows that looked out over 1,000 acres of green valley, a home filled with music and books and the laughter of their young daughter, Emily. He had built an empire, but she had built him a home. I was relentless in my business, he continued, a hard, self-loathing edge to his voice. I saw it as a game, a way of proving myself. I took risks. I crushed competitors. I believed that acquiring more was the same as becoming more. There was a man, a speculator named Marcus Cole. I drove him into bankruptcy over a railroad contract. It was a ruthless deal, even for me. I destroyed him completely. Took everything he had. I never gave it a second thought. They stopped to water the horses at a small stream, and the story paused. Alara watched him, saw the way his hands tightened on the reins, the muscles in his jaw working. He was not just recounting a memory. He was reliving a damnation. When they started riding again, his voice was even lower, flatter. I had to go to Denver. Another deal, another chance to expand the empire. Sarah begged me not to go. Emily was sick with a mild fever, and Sarah had a feeling, a premonition. She said, "We have enough, Jackson. When will it be enough?" I told her it was important. I promised I would be back in a week. He fell silent for a long time, the rhythmic plodding of the horses the only sound. Cole was not just ruined, he finally said, the words coming out as if torn from his throat. He was vengeful. He and 2 men he hired rode to the ranch in the middle of the night. They barred the doors from the outside, doused the porches in kerosene, and set it ablaze. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse, too far away to see it until it was too late. He stopped his horse, his whole body rigid. Alara stopped beside him. I was in a hotel in Denver, celebrating the new contract, when the telegraph came. By the time I rode back, a journey of 3 frantic days and nights, there was nothing left, just smoking timbers and the smell of death. They told me Sarah had been found by the window of Emily's room, her arms wrapped around our daughter. She had been trying to break the glass. His voice finally broke, a single, dry sob escaping him. My all-consuming guilt is not just that I destroyed Cole and created a monster. It is that Sarah was right. We had enough. I was not there to protect them because I was chasing a dollar I did not need. I was not there. Ilara's heart ached with a pain so profound it was almost her own. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she knew that this was a grief he had to walk through on his own. Words were useless against a wound so deep. Later that day, he told her the final part of the story. His voice was devoid of all emotion now. A chilling, empty monotone. I found Cole. It took me 6 months. I used my money and my influence to hunt him and his men down. I did not turn them over to the law. The law was too clean, too quick. I took from them what they took from me. I made them understand the nature of fire. He did not elaborate, but Ilara could hear the cold, empty finality of his vengeance in his voice. When it was over, I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no peace, just quiet. The man who took that revenge was not a husband or a father. He was just a shell, and I have been that shell ever since. They arrived at their destination late the next afternoon. The valley was just as beautiful as he had described it. But the beauty only made the scar at its center more horrific. On a gentle rise overlooking the creek stood the ruins of what had once been a grand ranch house. It was a skeleton, a tombstone. The stone chimneys rose into the sky like accusing fingers, and the foundation was a blackened, jagged outline of a life that was no more. Nature was trying to reclaim it. Wild morning glories crawled over the scorched stones, and tall prairie grass grew in what had once been a parlor. Jackson dismounted, his movements stiff, as if he were an old man. He walked toward the ruins alone, his boots crunching on the gravel and bits of charred wood. Ilara stayed by the horses, giving him the space he needed. She watched as he walked the perimeter of the foundation, his hand tracing the line of a vanished wall. He stopped where the front door would have been, then stepped inside, into the ghost of his home. He stood in the center of the ruins for a long, silent time, his head bowed, the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart. The cold composure he had maintained for years began to crack. His shoulders started to shake. A low sound, a groan of pure, animal agony, was ripped from his chest, and then he broke. He sank to his knees in the overgrown weeds, and the storm of grief he had held inside for so long finally erupted. It was a terrifying, terrible thing to witness. He roared his rage at the empty sky, his fists pounding the uncaring earth. He sobbed with the guilt of a man who believed he had failed in his most sacred duty. He cried out the names of his wife and daughter, his voice a raw, shredded plea to the ghosts that haunted this ground. It was years of pain, of guilt, of rage, of profound, soul-crushing loneliness, all pouring out of him in a single, violent, cleansing torrent. Ilara did not move. She did not try to stop him or offer the false comfort of empty words. She simply stood her ground, a silent, steady witness to his absolute desolation. She let him purge the poison that had been killing him from the inside out. Her quiet, unwavering presence was an anchor, a testament that he was not alone in this hell. The storm passed as all storms do, leaving a shattered, exhausted quiet in its wake. He remained on his knees, his body slumped, his weeping subsiding into ragged, shuddering breaths. Only then did she move. She walked into the ruins and knelt in the grass in front of him. She did not speak. She simply opened her arms, and he collapsed against her, his head on her shoulder. She held him, her arms wrapped tightly around his shaking body, sharing the immense weight of his sorrow, and in that shared moment of absolute desolation, amidst the ashes of his past, a new and unbreakable bond was forged between them. It was a love built not on the fleeting sweetness of idyllic romance, but on the profound, solemn acceptance of each other's deepest scars. In that ruin, They saw each other, fully and completely, for the first time. They made camp a mile down the valley that night, away from the haunted ground. They built a small fire, the flames a source of warmth and life, not destruction. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Everything essential had already been communicated in the language of shared grief. The chasm between them was gone, filled in by the rubble of their broken hearts. Later, wrapped in their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Alara watched him as he slept. His face, in repose, had lost the hard, haunted lines she was so used to seeing. He looked peaceful, younger. She felt a wave of love for him so powerful, so fierce. It was a physical ache in her chest. She heard him stir and saw that his eyes were open, watching her in the firelight. He held out his hand. Without hesitation, she rose and went to him, lying down beside him on his bedroll. He pulled the blanket over her, his arm wrapping around her, pulling her close. The air was cool, but where their bodies touched, she was warm. This was not the desperate, hungry kiss of their first encounter. This was something else entirely. He lifted a hand and gently traced the line of her jaw, his touch filled with a reverence and a tenderness that made her heart ache. He looked into her eyes, and she saw not a trace of the powerful benefactor or the haunted ghost, but the soul of the man she loved, stripped bare. When he kissed her, it was a slow, healing, and deeply emotional act. It was a kiss that acknowledged all the pain they had both endured, a kiss that accepted every scar, every ghost. His hands moved over her with a gentle reverence, rediscovering a world he thought he had lost forever. Her own touch was a balm, an answer to the years of his loneliness. Their lovemaking was a silent conversation, a physical manifestation of their choice to live and love again. It was not an escape from their pain, but an acceptance of it, a weaving of their two broken threads into a single, stronger cord. For Jackson, it was a reclamation of intimacy from the clutches of tragedy, a way to feel alive without the shadow of guilt. For Alara, it was an act of profound faith, a declaration that she was willing to build a new home in the heart of this man. No matter how scarred the foundation, it was a slow, quiet, and sacred act, a promise whispered in the language of touch, a vow to walk out of the ashes and into the light, together. The journey back to the farm was a quiet pilgrimage. The silence that accompanied them now was not the heavy, suffocating weight of unspoken anger, but a soft, comfortable blanket of shared understanding. They rode side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, a simple touch that spoke volumes more than words ever could. When they crested the final rise and saw the small, battered cabin nestled in the vast expanse of the plains, it looked different to them both. For Alara, it was no longer a fortress of solitude and struggle. For Jackson, it was not a temporary shelter. It was home. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of a storm and reforged in the ashes of his past, had been transformed. They were no longer a wealthy benefactor and a struggling widow, an orbiting moon of power and a small, embattled planet of pride. They were partners, equals in spirit, their souls laid bare to one another. The grand carriage and fine horses Jackson had summoned were sent away for good. His life of immense, isolating wealth was a country to which he had no desire to return. They chose to live in her humble cabin, its patched roof and worn floorboards a symbol not of poverty, but of their true beginning. The space, once filled with the ghosts of their separate pasts, now felt full of a shared future. Of course, the world did not transform overnight. The whispers and prejudices of the community remained, a low-grade fever of curiosity and suspicion. On their first trip into redemption for supplies, they felt the eyes of the entire town upon them. People peeked from behind curtains and stopped their conversations in the street to stare. The townspeople did not know what to make of them. The story of Jackson Thorne, the reclusive magnate, Living in a homesteader's shack with the widow Miller was the most astonishing piece of gossip to ever grace the Panhandle. But Ilara and Jackson faced it together as they walked into Henderson's store. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a simple, protective gesture of unwavering solidarity. They did not challenge the stares or acknowledge the whispers. They moved with a quiet dignity, their genuine affection for one another a visible force. When Martha Henderson approached them, her face a mixture of awe and confusion, Ilara greeted her with a warm, genuine smile, asking after her children by name. Jackson nodded politely, his gaze calm and direct, holding none of the intimidating power he had shown with Croft. He was not Jackson Thorne, landowner. He was simply the man at Ilara's side. This united front, so devoid of arrogance or shame, was a disarming thing. It did not take long for the townspeople to see that this was not a rich man's dalliance or a poor woman's lucky strike. It was something real, and slowly, cautiously, the suspicion began to melt away, replaced by a grudging and then a genuine respect. Guided by Ilara's profound empathy and practical wisdom, Jackson began to use his wealth in a way he never had before. The fortune that had been a curse, a tool for accumulating power and a monument to his guilt, began to transform into a source of life for the community. He was no longer a reclusive accumulator of assets, but a builder. His first act was to address the most contentious issue on the plains: water. He called a meeting, not of businessmen in a stuffy Blackstone office, but of the small homesteaders, the very people men like Croft had preyed upon for years. They gathered in the newly rebuilt barn on Ilara's farm, sitting on hay bales, their faces weathered with distrust and skepticism. Jackson did not stand before them and issue decrees. He stood beside Ilara and listened. She was his translator, not of words, but of the deep, unspoken currents of their lives. She knew their struggles firsthand, the fear of a dry well, the desperation of a failed crop, the quiet humiliation of being at the mercy of powerful men. She spoke their language. With her guidance, Jackson used his resources not to seize control, but to ensure fairness. He hired engineers to survey the land and financed the construction of a series of deep artesian wells and a network of irrigation ditches, establishing a charter of water rights that guaranteed every small landowner a fair and permanent share. It was an act that broke the back of the old system of control, liberating his new neighbors from the tyranny of thirst. Next, spurred by Ilara's conviction, they turned their attention to the future. A community cannot grow if its children do not, she had told him one evening, her voice full of a quiet passion. She had taught herself to read from the Bible and an old almanac, and she yearned for the children of the Panhandle to have more, together. They paced out a plot of land not far from the town center and drew up plans for a schoolhouse. It was a joint effort in the truest sense. Jackson provided the funding for the lumber, the books, and a proper teacher's salary, ensuring they could attract someone of real quality. But Ilara was the heart of the project. She organized the families, solicited their help in the construction, and planned the curriculum, ensuring it included not just reading and arithmetic, but practical skills suited to their lives. Ilara thrived in this new role. She had always been a leader, a survivor who led by quiet example. Now, she had a canvas on which to paint a larger future. She commanded a deep and abiding respect from the community, a respect earned not through her association with Jackson Thorne, but through her own character. Women sought her counsel. Men listened to her opinions at town meetings with a seriousness they rarely afforded any woman. She was not Mrs. Thorne. She was Ilara, a name that had become synonymous with resilience, compassion, and a fierce, practical wisdom. Jackson, in turn, found a purpose that had eluded him his entire life. He had spent years building a financial empire, but the work had left him hollow. Building a community, however, filled him with a satisfaction he had never known. He restructured his own bank in Blackstone, replacing the predatory practices with a new charter. He began offering loans based on character and the merit of a plan. Rather than on collateral a person did not have, he was effectively breaking the cycle of debt and desperation that had allowed men like Croft to flourish. And in doing so, he was atoning for his own past as a ruthless businessman. He was not just giving away money, he was investing in people, an idea Elara had taught him. Their life fell into a rhythm of shared work and quiet love. The farm remained their sanctuary. The small cabin their anchor in a changing world. The evenings were their own, a time to sit on the porch they had rebuilt together, watching the spectacular, painted sunsets that were the Panhandle's daily gift. It was in one such moment of perfect peace, with the sky bleeding orange and purple and the first stars beginning to appear, that the final conflict, a quiet, internal one, surfaced. They were sitting side by side on the porch steps, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. The air was cool and sweet with the smell of prairie grass. For weeks, they had been living in a state of grace, their shared purpose a powerful bond between them. But a shadow of the past, a flicker of an old insecurity, crossed Elara's face. "What is it?" Jackson asked softly. Sensing the shift in her, she was silent for a long moment, gathering her courage. "All of this," she began, her voice a near whisper, gesturing vaguely at the darkening landscape, at the life they were building. "It is more than I ever thought to have. I am happier than I have ever been." She turned her face to look at him, her eyes searching his in the twilight. "But sometimes, when it is quiet like this, I feel a tremor of fear, a fear that this is all fragile, that I am just a chapter in your life, a part of your healing, that one day you will be fully whole again, and this small life, this small farm, it will not be enough, that you will hear the call of the grand world you left behind, and you will return to it." It was her deepest, most secret vulnerability, laid bare. The fear that she, a simple woman of the plains, could not truly be enough for a man who had owned the world, that their love, born in the wreckage of their lives, might not be strong enough to survive the peace. Jackson listened, his expression serious. He did not dismiss her fears with easy promises. He understood that after his deception, his words alone were not enough. He needed to show her, in an act so profound and permanent it could never be questioned, that his commitment was absolute. He stood up and took her hand. "Come with me," he said. He led her inside the cabin, from a locked metal box where he now kept his important papers. He retrieved 2 documents. The first, he handed to her. It was the deed to her farm, the title clear and pristine, solely in her name. "This is yours," he said firmly. "It was always yours. You saved it with your own strength long before I ever came here." Then he placed the second item on the table. It was a massive, leather-bound portfolio, heavy and thick, tied with a black ribbon. He untied the ribbon and opened it. Inside were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of individual deeds, each one representing a vast tract of land, a mine, a bank, a railroad spur. It was the physical manifestation of his empire. It was the entire county, captured on paper. From the shadows near the door, another man stepped forward. It was a lawyer from Blackstone, a man Jackson had arranged to be there, waiting for this very moment. He was their witness. Jackson took a fountain pen from the lawyer, uncapped it, and turned to the first deed in the portfolio. With a steady hand, he signed his name, transferring the title not to her, but to a new trust. He did the same for the next deed, and the next, and the next. He worked through the entire portfolio, his pen scratching quietly in the lamplight. A slow, deliberate act of surrender and union. When he was finished, he pushed the massive portfolio toward her. The lawyer notarized the final page with a heavy stamp. Jackson took both of her hands in his eyes locking with hers. They were shining with an emotion so pure, so absolute, that it took her breath away. "This was all worthless when I was alone," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. a collection of paper and dust that brought me nothing but grief. It is not mine or yours. It is ours. Everything I have, and everything I am, is ours. Together. My home is not some grand house in a distant city. My home is right here, on this porch, with you. It is the only home I ever want. The story concluded not with the fanfare of a wedding, but with this profound, quiet act of union, a legal and spiritual merging of two lives into one. They walked back out onto the porch and sat together, their hands intertwined, watching the last faint rays of sun disappear over the horizon. The harsh western landscape, which had once represented only struggle and loss for them both, now held the bright, infinite promise of a shared future, their love, born in the heart of a tornado and tempered in the ashes of the past, stood as a quiet, resilient testament to the idea that even the deepest of tragedies can sometimes lead to the most beautiful and unexpected forms of hope. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.